Welcome to another Tiny Desk Chapel. It's great to be able to see you again, something we're looking forward to being able to do in person in the near future. This term, we look forward to the Easter holidays, and Easter is a time that is celebrated by Christians around the world every year. But perhaps it's unusual to think that it's a celebration, given that it starts with the commemoration of the death of a person. So I thought over this term we might have a bit of a reflection upon why it is a celebration. And we're going to have a look at the risen Jesus, the reigning Jesus, and the returning Jesus. These three aspects of Jesus to reflect upon over this term. The first thing to think about Easter is, well, let's go back to the beginning. What was that first Easter like? When we open up the Gospels, we discover that first Easter Sunday started very early. It started at dawn. The Sabbath was just finishing as the sun was coming up, and there are some people heading towards Jesus' burial tomb. He was buried on the Friday evening. Saturday, the Sabbath, was a day of rest. Nobody went near the tomb on that holy day. And then we see a vision of a picture of some women heading towards Jesus' tomb. And they're carrying with them perfumes and other ointments, other things that you would use to prepare a dead body. So that tells us right away from that first Easter that many people did not have an expectation that Easter was going to be a cause for celebration. They were going there to treat Jesus' body for its final rest. Now, when the women arrived at the tomb, they discovered that Jesus is not there. In fact, instead, there are angels who declare to them that Jesus is not here because he is risen. He is risen from the dead. Now, this, of course, was of some surprise to people that were going to prepare his dead body. They immediately returned to the disciples. And again, we get another picture here. We get a picture of a group of people who are upset. They're sad about what has happened on what we call now Good Friday. That Friday before, when they had seen their friend and teacher and mentor executed under Roman authority. So their expectation that was Jesus was dead as well, that this was all over. And so when they hear the news from the women who've gone to the tomb, they're a little surprised and, in fact, skeptical. Some of them run to the tomb to check things out for themselves to see, what's really going on here. What are they really talking about? Now, there has been no scene of Jesus' body at this stage. So they're left with an empty tomb and still left with many thoughts about, well, what can all this possibly mean? It's only later in that day that Jesus appears to them himself. And this is where our understanding of the resurrection comes from. It comes from Jesus himself appearing, not just his body disappearing and therefore people thinking he was alive, but Jesus reappearing to his disciples. And it's an amazing scene. They're overjoyed, but with all sorts of complex emotions about, what's going on, what's happening, how can this even be the case? Jesus appears to them, indeed even eats with them and spends time with them, just as he had a few days before when he had celebrated the Last Supper with them on the Thursday night before his execution. But one of the disciples isn't there on the occasion that Jesus appears. His name was Thomas, which means twin, and he's not there when Jesus appears. And so when the disciples tell him what they have seen, he is understandably also perplexed, indeed a little skeptical. Let me read for you a little bit of Thomas's encounter with the disciples after they have seen him alive again. It comes from John chapter 20. Verse 24 says, "Now Thomas, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand in his side, I will not believe.' A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them this time. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.' Then he said to Thomas, 'Put your finger here See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Well, as we heard there, Thomas has his doubts, which is understandable in the context. But one of the interesting things is that Jesus recognizes, acknowledges those doubts and invites Thomas to investigate, to say, "Okay, Thomas, these are the things you needed to believe that I was risen from the dead. Well, here they are. Here is the evidence. You can see from these scars that it was truly me, the same person, not someone just trying to pretend to be Jesus. And yes, I heard you when you said you wanted to, touch where I was stabbed to make sure that it was me, the one who had been killed, who is now risen from the dead." Jesus provides him with the evidence that he needs. But then he also says to Thomas, but there are going to be people who are going to believe without these physical sort of evidence of Jesus. There are going to be people in the future, people like Christians today, who are going to trust in what the disciples have seen and reported into the future. They're going to need this testimony from the first eyewitnesses, and that's going to be enough for them to understand, yes, Jesus was in fact risen from the dead. Many of the disciples will go on to give their lives based on this truth, that Jesus was in fact who he said he was, the Lord and risen Saviour. So this wasn't just something that they had concocted. They hadn't expected it. As we've seen, they even doubted it, some of them, when it happened. But by the end of their lives, they were willing to die for this because they had seen it. They had seen it with their own eyes, and they were spending the rest of their lives proclaiming the good news of Jesus' return from the dead. Now, we'll see why it was good news in future chapters as we think about what does it mean for Jesus to be risen from the dead? What does it mean for Jesus to still be alive today and not just back then? And what does it mean for us as we expect his return, as Jesus told his people to? So Jesus' appearance to his disciples, they were regular over this time, and he didn't just go on and then die of old age. As we read in the accounts, Jesus spent about 40 days with his disciples after his resurrection. And then he, having prepared them for what was next, for their job as his eyewitnesses to the world and the leaders of the church of the future, he then ascends to heaven. He returns back to where he came from, not having died to do it, but is taken back into heaven. Both literally, they see him ascend into the sky, but also metaphysically, he returns to God's right hand. And so we read in Luke chapter 4, when he had led them out of the vicinity of Bethany, it's a town outside Jerusalem, he lifted up his hands and blessed them, and while he was blessing them, he left them and was taken up into heaven. Then they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they stayed continually at the temple, praising God. So we read from that account, what happened to Jesus after those 40 days, but also what the response was of the disciples to this amazing event. They worshipped him. Now, for first century Jewish people, this is a very sensitive word to talk about. Only God could be worshipped. It was the first commandment that Moses had given the Jewish people. And so their willingness to use that word in reference to Jesus means that his resurrection had convinced them that he was God, God the Son, who had come into the earth to teach us, to guide us, to die for us, and was raised from the dead to prove that he was who he said he was, the Messiah, the Lord of heaven and earth. So what do we get from all of these things? Well, firstly, I think that Jesus defies our expectations. If you think you know everything about Jesus, the disciples felt that they knew everything about Jesus. And yet, Jesus defied their expectations in his resurrection from the dead. They had plenty still to learn about who Jesus was, what he had come to do, what he was like. And that's true for you and for I. Jesus invites investigation. He doesn't just, say, oh, well, just got to take it or leave it. He says, okay, well, come and see. Come and listen to my words. Come and see my actions. And that's why the disciples were so keen to spread the word about Jesus, and indeed for some of them to write down accounts of Jesus' life and teaching so that future generations like you and I could come and see. We could investigate as Jesus invites us to. So Jesus defies expectations, but he invites expectation. And finally, we learn from Jesus' resurrection is that Jesus is not finished. He still has a plan and purpose to be fulfilled, the bringing about of God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And that's something we're going to explore in our future times together as we look at not just the risen Jesus, but the reigning Jesus and the returning Jesus in chapels to come. So I hope that that encourages you to think about, okay, you might have doubts. It's okay to have doubts. It's okay to have questions. Jesus invites you to take those questions, take those doubts to him. Find out more about the risen Jesus so that you can have those questions answered for yourself. I look forward to speaking to you again in the future in chapel as we get ready for Easter this year.